Hi guys, welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about health inequality, continuing this unit that we've been repeatedly talking about stratification and inequality in the United States. Before we jump in, just a quick reminder that you guys have your second quiz coming up next week. It will be the exact same format as the first quiz, same number of points. So if you want to go back and reference that assignment description that I originally posted, I really recommend that you guys do that. It also has some studying tips in there if you're looking for new ways to effectively study for our tests. I also want to remind you all that we are now switching the format of office hours to appointment-based, and this is just to give you guys more flexibility and to make myself more available to all of you. So if you have any questions before the quiz, you want to review quiz 1 with me to think about where you went wrong and what you can do for next time, I'm always available, happy to help you guys out there. Remember, even though we're online, you're not going through this course alone, and I'm still here for you to make sure that you are as successful as you'd like to be in this course. All right, so all of that said, let's just jump into the material, and if you have any questions or anything, just shoot me a note. All right, so what are some of the things that we're going to talk about today? I know that I'm not sure how many pre-med people we have in this class. I think we might have a couple, but normally when I teach an intro class, there's a lot of pre-med students, and it's always interesting teaching health inequality because we're obviously going to be talking about health and the body in a really different way than many of us are used to talking about it. So we're going to be thinking about the body and health obviously rooted in the social world and how all of these different kinds of social forces we've already been talking about influence health outcomes, right? So health not just being something that's biologically determined or that you're predisposed to, but that is socially influenced. Okay, so we're going to be asking a few questions today. So first off, how is health and medicine a social, political, and cultural phenomenon? Okay. What health inequality exists in the United States today? So what does health inequality look like in our country right now? Obviously, why does this health inequality exist? And similar to how we formatted our lecture on gender and sexuality, we're going to be thinking about health from a structural and then a cultural standpoint, so you can see different perspectives. And then finally, we're going to wrap up our lecture by thinking a little bit more about how we conceptualize illness and the body in our society. So we're going to think about how certain illnesses become stigmatized, okay, and we're going to talk about the concept of stigma. And then we're also going to think about how stigma intersects with lots of different social identities like race, gender, class, etc. Okay. This lecture, I believe, I'm just counting now. Yeah, so this lecture is actually going to have 4 parts. It doesn't mean that it's longer. If you ever see like a lecture that has more parts, it doesn't mean that there's more material. It just means that the way I've chosen to break it up, I just think would be easier for it to package certain ideas into these different sections. So there will be 4 parts today. Make sure that you watch all of those. All right, so in this first part, we're going to start very simply by framing medicine as a social problem. Okay, so thinking about it as something that has to do with our social forces around us. Okay, so the myth that we're going to be dispelling today is that medicine and healthcare is exclusively driven by pure science, right? That it's something that's only happening in our body, and that science is something that is completely objective and separate from the social world. Instead, we're going to be talking about medicine as a kind of social problem that is obviously based in science, right? But is also rooted in all of the social dynamics we live in every day. So we're going to be thinking about power and hierarchies, structure, culture, political changes, et cetera, et cetera. So to get our feet wet thinking about this, I have a couple of cases that I want us to look at to sort of help us start thinking about how medicine is itself a social problem. Come on, there we go. Okay, so the first case we're going to be looking at is the case of Henrietta Lacks. All right, so to start with, when we think about science, we're often thinking about kind of that individual scientist in the lab doing experiments and then having some kind of like eureka moment where they make a discovery that changes the course of our health or changes the course of science in general. And the reality is that's not true, right? That science, number one, rarely happens like that. It's a very prolonged process that involves a lot of people. But also, science very much and scientific developments rely very much on the society that they're happening in, what's happening, and then also the sort of the people involved in creating science that aren't even scientists, okay? And that's a little vague, right? But we'll talk about it a little bit more. So, like I said, we're going to be thinking about this in the context of Henrietta Lacks. If you haven't already learned about Henrietta Lacks, there's great books written about her. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is probably the most famous, and it's a good read, right? And it goes by actually pretty quickly. And if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend you do, because it's a really compelling story. Okay, there we go. So Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman. She lived from 1920 to 1951, okay? And the story of Henrietta Lacks, right, is that she visited Johns Hopkins Hospital initially with vaginal bleeding, okay? So she was experiencing these symptoms, obviously was concerned about her health, and went to the hospital. And what was found is that she had cancer, and I believe it was cervical cancer specifically. What happened while she was there at the hospital is that doctors took samples of her tissue and her cells, right, obviously, to do biopsies and whatnot. And what they discovered is that her cells actually behaved a little differently than other cells they had encountered, right? So previously, scientists in labs were using cells to try and make discoveries to understand illnesses, but they couldn't get very far because those cells died very quickly, right? The life course of the cells that they got from samples expired very quickly, which meant that they actually had trouble understanding much about them, right? Because they had a small frame and a time frame to work within. So what happened is that they saw that Henrietta Lacks cells behaved differently because they doubled every 24 hours. So instead of dying very quickly, they were actually multiplying and reproducing, okay? And so this intrigued the scientists a lot, because this could be groundbreaking for medical research, right, and studying the body, because they had suddenly a capacity to think about the body differently. That sounds good, right? And scientific advancement is generally good, right? But the problem here is that these cells were taken from Henrietta without her consent and without her awareness, okay? To sort of add insult to injury, Henrietta was told very little about her cancer and soon died, really kind of, now we understand from neglect, right, that she could have she could have been given more treatment, right, but because of her position as a Black woman, was kind of neglected by the doctors. However, while she's being neglected, her cells are being taken without her consent and used in the lab, right? To this day, her family has never been compensated for the use of her cells, which are still used in labs today. Okay, that's how big of a deal it was, right? That we're still using what we call HeLa cells. So the first two letters of Henrietta, first two letters of Lacks, the HeLa cells, we're still using them in labs today. Her family still has not been compensated, despite how foundational they were and how novel they were, and despite the fact that Henrietta, there was clearly some negligence, right, on the part of her care providers. Okay, so why do I bring this up? Why is the case of Henrietta Lacks important here? Her case really shows us that our interactions with the healthcare sphere are socially mediated in two ways, right? So first, we can think about exploitation, right, in regard to who benefits most from our healthcare system, and then who doesn't, right, and with what consequences. So when we think about Henrietta Lacks, we're thinking about a woman whose body was used for scientific advancement, right, but whose health was neglected, right? So she was actually objectified, seen as a scientific tool that they could use, but whose health wasn't a priority in that case, okay? The second question is, right, is who dies from health problems? We know that access to healthcare and the success of healthcare is often dependent on social hierarchies, right? So as we'll talk about today, Black women in this country are far more likely to die of certain conditions than white women, for example. And this isn't because of some medical predisposition, but because of social hierarchies and how we value lives and how we view people's bodies. And we'll get into that in a little bit. All right, so let's think about our second case here, if you're not already convinced maybe that medicine can be thought of as a social problem. Okay, so for the second case, I want to talk about the history of gynecology, and I think this ties into the story of Henrietta Lacks kind of fluidly as well. So the father of gynecology, right, the person who, quote unquote, invented gynecology, is credited to be J. Marion Sims, and this is because he developed a particular kind of treatment that was really integral for studying vulvas and with reproductive health care, right? And I'm not going to pretend to be a doctor, right? I talk about this stuff. That part is less important than this next part. So while he's credited as being the father of gynecology, and until fairly recently, there was a pretty large statue of him in New York, sort of crediting him for his accomplishments. He discovered this treatment by experimentation on enslaved women. So he used their bodies essentially largely without any treatment for their pain, right? Kind of just used their bodies to experiment and test his treatments on these enslaved women. Okay, so this is because after the importation of slaves was banned, plantation owners wanted to ensure healthy domestic births among their enslaved women, for obvious reasons. And this motivated the progress of gynecology, right? That if we could find a way to make births more successful and to treat reproductive health, that perhaps this population of enslaved people in America could theoretically produce a new generation of slaves. Okay, so this is another example of how medical practice is inherently rooted in the social world. Okay, obviously gynecology looks differently than this now and is motivated by different reasons, but we still can study gynecology as something that is rooted in power hierarchies and inequality that was produced for a particular reason, to reproduce social hierarchies. Okay, and then this will bring us to our last case, case 3, which is social bias in healthcare today. Right, so the prior two cases we're talking about historical moments in time or historical figures. Now I kind of want to bring us into the present day and how this is still impacting us. So, while of course most doctors are, we hope, right, doing their best to provide the best care for us, our social biases and the hierarchy inherently find their way into medical practice. Okay, so I have these questions written here on the right to sort of prompt our discussion on this, which is, how do our biases about others' bodies impact our medical care, right? Who do we think deserves treatment, right? Who do we think is most vulnerable? Who do we think is most capable of carrying pain, right? All of these questions, whether doctors are conscious of it or not, are kind of rooted in how they deliver care to their patients. Who is the ideal patient, right? Who is the best person to take care of that doctors would want to see in their office, right? Who do we take seriously and who do we not, right? When someone ends up in a doctor's office complaining of particular symptoms or experiences, who do we believe and who maybe's testimony do we not believe, okay? And that leads me into this article on the right here, which is called How Doctors Take Women's Pain Less Seriously. In short, what this article describes is that when women come into the doctor's office or the ER complaining of severe pain, on average, their pain is taken less seriously than a male counterpart who could be complaining of the same things, okay? This is rooted in sort of ideas about women's bodies, right, and whether women, for example, are talking about serious complaints they have or whether they're being whiny or, kind of not handling their own bodies in such a way, right, that if a man is complaining about pain, he must really be hurting because men are strong and can take care of themselves. But if a woman's complaining about pain, it's probably nothing, right? She's probably making a fuss out of nothing. This is also more complicated when we start to think about class and race. Okay, so people of color are also less likely to have their pain taken seriously in doctors' offices and less likely to be prescribed painkillers because of stereotypes about drug addiction, specifically sort of the misuse of pain meds and et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. Okay, so what does this tell us? This tells us that all of these historical things, right, that influence the development of medicine are still rooted in the doctor's office, right, and how we think about medicine and the body. It's still very much informed by social hierarchies that exist outside the doctor's office, right, social forces that are shaping how we think about the world. Those are internalized within the doctor, and then also, as we'll talk about structurally, within the system as well. Okay, so our big takeaway here before we move into the more nitty-gritty, okay, is that, of course, health is biological, right? It's determined by our bodies, and medicine is ultimately good, right? I don't want us to forget that modern medicine is a blessing, right? That is a good thing. But health and medicine are also wrapped up in the messiness of our social world, right? We can't untangle them, just as we can't untangle social class from lots of other things in our world, okay? And as we're going to talk about today, social phenomenon impact the health of our bodies, right? The physical symptoms we experience, our experiences within the medical field, and then also differences between populations and health outcomes between different groups of people. All right, so that's going to conclude us for part one. In part two, we're going to start to think about some of the structural reasons why we see health inequality and what that looks like today.